Hey everyone, good afternoon. Thanks for joining me. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. And today, I thought I'd have some fun with you talking about digital LSAT prep and LSAT study schedules, law school admissions, as we are now towards the end of the 2019 calendar year, although the law school admission cycle is not quite over just yet. So just out of curiosity, how many of you have taken the LSAT already? And how many of you are still scheduled to take it in November or January or beyond? There's a chat function here on the sidebar, and I invite you to just type your responses and any questions you have in the chat. I'd love to get some thoughts and some engagement from you just so I have a sense of where everyone currently stands. So I got Marissa saying she took it in September. Well, thanks for sharing that, Marissa. Anyone else taking it going forward in November or January? We've got Annika asking about when summer LSAT dates will be released. So the funny thing is that LSAC calendar years run from June to May. And so right now they have only published the LSAT test dates through April 2020. But in the spring, most likely, they will open up registration for the summer and fall LSATs and beyond. And we can expect that they will offer an LSAT nearly every month. They will most likely offer it in June and July, and then in September and October and November as well. We don't know the exact dates, but those are probably the months that they will offer it, given that that's what they've offered previously in the past year. We've got Emmanuel saying he'll take it in April. We've got Ronald saying he'll take it in January. So we've got a good broad spread here. And so I'll try to cover longer timelines here, since I know a number of you, some are taking it in November, but others are taking it on a longer timeline moving forward. But before we get into that, I do want to cover some common LSAT myths. So I want to play a little true or false with you here. And so I'm going to open up some questions that I want to get your feedback on. So here's one for you. True or false, law schools average multiple LSAT scores. Is that true or false? There is a right answer and there is a wrong answer, but I invite you to just give it your best shot. We've got quite a few people who know what they're talking about here. I've got quite a few falses here. I got a false from Casey, Marissa, and Ronald. Annika saying generally false. So yeah, you're all correct. Law schools do not average multiple LSAT scores. There may be a couple of exceptions to this. Some schools will say that they consider multiple LSAT scores, but this is a change that went into effect back in 2006. Back in 2006 and prior, the American Bar Association required law schools to submit the average score of matriculating applicants, meaning applicants who were going to attend a given law school. That has since changed. Since 2006, it's changed so that now the American Bar Association only requires law schools to submit the highest score of matriculating applicants. And so as a result, law schools only have incentive to care about that because that's what goes to the US News rankings as well, which is what a lot of law school admission officers' jobs rest upon. Can they keep their school up in the rankings? And so what this means is that there is always an incentive for you to retake. And I'll talk a little bit more about retakes going forward, but I did want to get that out of the way since that is a common misconception I see from a lot of students. Here's another one. The LSAT is administered over 100,000 times each year. True or false? What do you think? This one's a bit tougher. I know not everyone's looking at the statistics published from LSAC on this. We've got Alex and Marissa and Mariah all saying true. We've got Emmanuel saying false. This is a tricky one. I won't hold it against you if you got it wrong. It actually is true. And you can see the numbers here from LSAC's website. In the most recent cycle, 138,000 LSATs administered. And so you see this is total LSATs administered. In prior years, 129,000, 109, 105, 101. So you see the numbers have gone up and down over the years. The 09 to 2010 year was especially high. A lot of people applying to law school that year. So the short answer is that it is true. It is true that there are over 100,000 LSATs administered each year, but some of those are retakes. So the actual number of applicants and number of people taking the LSAT may be lower, but of course, as we know, a lot of students are taking the LSAT multiple times, and so that can inflate the number of LSATs administered. So again, this idea of retaking, especially popular, nothing wrong with it. Law schools do not care if you have 2 or even 3 retakes on your record. Even 4 could be okay. 5 or 6 may start to look a little bit shaky, but 3 or 4, totally fine. Here's another one. The LSAT is graded on a curve, true or false? We have a mix of responses here. Alex saying false, Marissa saying true, Casey, Hanan, and Annika saying false, Emmanuel saying true. So quite a spread of responses here on both true and false. And this may hinge on what does the word curve mean, right? So there are raw score conversions where you can take the number of credited responses or correct answers you have on the LSAT, and that will determine your scaled score out of 180. But that curve, that raw score conversion, is not necessarily based directly upon all the other people taking that same LSAT as you that day, meaning you have no incentive to sabotage your fellow test takers because someone else doing worse will not make you relatively do better as a result. In fact, LSAC has already given themselves a rough draft of what that raw score conversion will look like based upon their detailed statistical analysis of the difficulty level of given questions. And so an LSAT test form or a prep test that allows you to get 14 questions wrong and still achieve a score of 170 means that was an especially difficult LSAT test. Alternatively, an LSAT that only allows you to get 9 questions wrong or 10 questions wrong to get a 170 was a relatively easier LSAT exam. But the LSAT test forms are all equated, and so a 170 on one LSAT is meant to be the same as a 170 on a different LSAT, and the performance of others in the room, the same room as you or taking it on the same day, should not actually have an impact on what your score ends up being. So I hope that clears that up. Now, here's one more. True or false, undisclosed LSATs are harder. True or false? I'll give you a moment to think that one over. Let's see, we've got a couple of folks saying false. We have one person asking, what is an undisclosed LSAT? Another person saying false. So I will start off by just clearing up what is an undisclosed LSAT. So LSAC, the Law School Admission Council, releases 3 LSAT test forms per year. Those are those numbered LSATs, like there was test 87, 88, there'll be 89, 90, and so on. Those are all released LSATs, 3 released or disclosed per year. Now, there are a handful each year that are not released. It used to be the LSAT was only administered 4 times per year, and the February LSAT was the single LSAT that was not released. Why was it not released? Why was it not disclosed? Because LSAC wants to save that test form to reuse on future LSAT administrations. Because although there were only 4 major test dates per year, there were also international or overseas administrations, there are Sabbath observers administrations, there are accommodated test taker administrations if there is inclement weather and they have to postpone a test date for a certain region of the country. That needs to be a reused test form. They can't create entirely new exams for every administration because it costs them nearly $1 million to produce a single test form. That's how much investment goes into this. And so if they can save a little money and reuse those tests, they're going to do that. And now, this year and beyond, they are now administering the LSAT 9 or 10 times per year, nearly every month, but they have not yet ramped up their test creation production process to create 9 or 10 new test forms per year. And so as a result, they need to reuse more exams, which means they need to save all of those undisclosed LSATs in the bank to pull out when they need them. And so as a result, some people are looking and seeing, well, if the LSAT that was administered in February 2017 in Asia might be reused on a future LSAT in North America. And so you could look at that old test and see what's going to be on it as a way to potentially figure out what you're going to need to study for a future test. Now, you can go down a rabbit hole on this. Of course, alternatively, you can just study everything that could possibly come up to prepare yourself. But because these undisclosed tests are that undisclosed, there's a certain air of mystery around them. And as a result, a lot of students worry that those are going to be harder. The truth is, they are not harder. They are no different in any way. They just have not yet been released. So I wouldn't worry about taking an undisclosed LSAT. The only downside is, of course, you don't get to see a copy of your test. You can't analyze what you got right and wrong. But I don't really think it's a huge deal because you could take your own exam as a diagnostic to see where you stand. It would be nice to have the results of your official exam, but them's the breaks. You just got to do the best you can. And so I'd say, don't worry too much about it. Take the LSAT when you are ready. And if there's only 3 released per year, but 10 exams per year, it doesn't really make sense for you to just wait around simply to have a disclosed LSAT because you prefer that. They're all equated. They're all roughly the same. Now, one question I'm getting a lot from you today is about this idea of retakes and how to prepare for a retake specifically. And so I do have some thoughts I can share around that. Now, specifically, why do I think retaking is a good idea? It's because, like I said initially, law schools do not average multiple scores. They only take the highest score, meaning that there is no downside to retaking. In fact, there is a score band or margin of error of 3.5 points on either end, meaning that, let's say that you deserved to get a 160. That was your true aptitude. That means that you might get a 160 one day, the next day get a 157, the following day get a 164. And the LSAT is a perfectly valid exam. And so if you are registered for November, let's say you get a 160 in November, that's fine. But a 164, of course, would open far more doors for you than a 160 would. And so I know that one of our participants tonight, Alex, I think it was saying that taking both November and January. And so if you are taking both November and January, you take November, you get a 160, but maybe you think you can do better, or even just through luck alone, you could do 3 to 4 points better. If you just study a little bit and stay fresh until January and you get 4 points higher, obviously a 164 will open far more doors for you than a 160 would. And so it's worth delaying your application slightly if you could do even just a few points better. And then if you actually studied significantly during your winter break, during the holidays, you had some time off, you took a break from work, you were in college and you have that winter break, you do even better than that. Maybe you improve by 5 or 6 points. That's amazing. A 166, that'll open even more doors, get you more scholarship money, get you into a better law school. That's the easiest money you'll ever make. And because they don't average multiple scores, there really is no downside to delaying your application by a few months, given that 5-6 point increase is huge for you. Now, how do you study for a retake? What do you do differently as you are preparing for a retake? I often encounter students who they're already scoring pretty well. Maybe they're in the 170s, or the high 160s, but they've burned through all the recent material. And they say, I've already done all the recent exams. Maybe they are really gunners and they've done every exam ever released, which is hard to believe, but some people do that. If you've done all 90 plus exams released, the 88 that are numbered, the handful that are unnumbered, you've done plenty of material. But if you were to redo all of those exams, would you get perfect 180s? I doubt you would, and that's okay. I think virtually nobody would. But the fact is that if you're getting anything less than a 180, given that you've already seen those problems before and you've reviewed them and you know the right answers, there is still something major you can learn from those exams. And so I would encourage you to redo them. Print out fresh copies, photocopy them, buy a new book if you need to have a clean copy, redo those problems. I have Annika asking about the best resources to shoot for a high score of 175 plus. Honestly, it's not a resource at that point. Once you've built a strong foundation and let's say, assume that you're already in the 160s and there's no particular weak area, like you're not having trouble with strength in particular or grouping games in particular, you just are getting hard problems wrong because they're hard. You may not need more resources. What you need is to level up your review process. Too often, students will do exam after exam, measure their results, be happy or sad about them, and move on. And that's understandable, of course, because we want that instant feedback. It's kind of like the LSAT becomes like a game for us where we want to complete problems, then immediately check the answer key and see how we did. And that's understandable. You want that feedback. There's that certain randomized reward of doing better or doing worse and being happy or sad, and then doing the next problem to see how that one's going to go. But the value in doing these problems is not simply to measure yourself. It's to learn from your mistakes and to figure out what your weak areas are. And at a certain point, it's not about getting things wrong because of some sort of question stem type or game type. It's that they're hard problems, they're difficult methods of reasoning, but you've got to study those in depth to avoid making the same mistakes again, because the LSAT does repeat itself again and again and again. This is primarily a test of pattern recognition. And when I'm doing a new problem, I'm not doing that problem for the first time. Obviously, it may have a new disguise on it, but I have done that problem many times in different forms in the past, where the method of reasoning might be the same, but the topic may be different, the question set may be different, but I can automatically relate that new method of reasoning or that new problem with that same method of reasoning back to previous problems I've done. And so I can recognize it and solve it more quickly as a result. To me, that's the benefit here. And so when I'm analyzing tough problems that I've had trouble with in depth, I'm better understanding those methods of reasoning so that I won't make the same mistake again. And so I would encourage you, if you're shooting for a top score, or really anywhere you're at, slow down, make sure that you're thoroughly understanding the stimulus to the point where you could explain it to a friend, you could paraphrase it, you could summarize it, you could twist it or tweak it a little bit so that, let's say it was initially a flaw question, you reframe it for yourself as necessary assumption or strengthen or weaken. Being able to play with the LSAT problems at that level to better see them from the test maker's perspective, that's what helps you improve. And that's what helps you move towards a top score. So I hope that addressed your question, Annika, but I'm happy to answer follow-ups. Now let's see, we've got Alex here asking, if you don't get the score you want, should you study for an extra year and postpone? That's a great question. And so it becomes quite a dilemma at this point, of course, because nobody wants to delay by an entire year. People usually want to be done with the LSAT and move on with their lives. And if you're in college, you want to go straight to law school. If you're working as a paralegal or something else, you just want to move on. But as I said, getting just a few more points could open far more doors for you, get you into a better law school, get you more scholarship money. And so, yes, it could be worth delaying. And at this point of the year, if you're taking it in November or January, I'd say ideally January is the last test date I would recommend shooting for. And instead, beyond January, I would say don't take it in February, March and still apply this cycle. You're better off waiting a bit longer, thoroughly mastering the LSAT, and then applying at the beginning of the following cycle. Because at the beginning of the cycle, it's a little bit easier to get in, and there's also more scholarship money available. And so that's worth a lot, of course. I mean, more scholarship money, another $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year for 3 years. That's the easiest money you'll ever make. You know, it could be at that point, if you could make $30,000 a year in scholarships for 3 years, that's $90,000. That could be worth delaying an entire year and doing nothing but studying for the LSAT potentially. So that's, when you look at it in that way, studying for the LSAT is actually the easiest money you'll ever make. I have someone in the LSAT Unplugged Facebook group who just posted yesterday that he got a full ride to law school, no debt at all. Maybe for living expenses, he might take out a loan or something, but no tuition, free law school, a free JD, that's pretty amazing. And so getting that based on a top LSAT score that's above the median of the law school you want to go to, definitely a good idea. So yes, I would recommend postponing ideally, slowing down, especially if you're working or in school and having a tough time fitting in the time to study. It's worth taking a slower pace and delaying a little bit if that's what you'll need to reach your fullest potential. And I usually recommend studying for 5 to 6 months to reach your fullest LSAT potential. I know that's more time than most people want to spend. Most people want to knock it out in 2 to 3 months, but I think that's because you're underestimating just how difficult the LSAT is. It actually is worth taking the time to master this exam if it'll get you more scholarship money or get you into a better school. Now, I got a follow-up here asking, do law schools look down upon taking the LSAT before your junior year? Not really. I mean, LSAT scores are good for 5 years. And so I'd recommend ultimately taking the LSAT when you will do the best on it. And so if sophomore year or the summer between sophomore and junior year is when you'll have the most time to study and then you could take it in the fall, yeah, do it then. Alternatively, taking it, let's say studying during winter break, take it in January or February, that could be good too. It's really just about when you will be ready to take it. I don't really have much more to say on that, but again, keep in mind that the scores are good for 5 years. And so as a result, if you plan to apply within 5 years, that's a good idea. Alternatively, if you're in high school, probably a little bit early to start thinking about that, but I do get the occasional person asking that. As for the optimal time, I think typically doing the bulk of your studying between, if you're in college, during the summer or during winter break is when it's typically the easiest to fit in the time to study. And so I would take it immediately after that. Or alternatively, if you have recently graduated and you haven't yet found a job or you're not working yet and you can study full time, some folks are in that fortunate position. If you are, fantastic, study then. Or take a lighter course load during one semester so that you can focus more on your studies during that time. So some students will take up maybe 3 or 4 classes only, maybe take 12 credits instead of 16 or 17, and treat the LSAT studying like a part-time job or like a 6-credit class, let's say. Marissa's asking, would having 2 points above the median LSAT and a 4.0 GPA get you a significant scholarship at a particular law school? I would suspect so, because a 4.0 GPA is, of course, on the higher end. Being above the median LSAT, even by a couple of points, is also on the higher end. And so, yeah, I think it would get you a significant scholarship. I can't make promises, of course. There are some details about particular schools and their admission cycles, and maybe there are other softer factors that could have an impact. But on average, being above the median with either number, meaning LSAT or GPA or both, that should entice schools to want to lure you or attract you to their school by offering you scholarship money. And LSAC actually has an LSAT GPA calculator, and I'll find the link for you here, where you can input your numbers and then see where you would stack up relative to a school's accepted students or matriculating students. So you could input your numbers on this side I've linked you here, and you can see how you might stack up at a variety of schools. We have Alex asking about reading comp inferential questions. So I'll try to address this as broadly as I can. I think that for reading comprehension, there's 3 types of questions. There's global main point type questions like main idea, primary purpose, and passage organization questions. Those are general. I would knock those out first. Then you have detail-oriented questions with specific line references or quoted sections or phrases. Then you have more inferential questions that require a bit more reading between the lines for what the author would be most likely to agree with. These questions are not licensed for you to bring in outside information or make your best guess. There actually is always textual support within the passage for whatever you may choose. And so I would gravitate towards more moderate choices that you can always relate back to certain lines in the passage. So as part of your review process, I would encourage you to always go back to the passage and find a line supporting your given choice. It's always there. You may not find it in the moment under timed conditions, but upon review, you can always find a line supporting that. So just add that to your review process. Let's see, as far as which LSAT prep options are right for you, how do you choose an LSAT prep option, whether it's a book or a course or a tutor? Do you want live online? Do you want recorded online? Do you want an in-person prep class? Everyone learns differently. So I'd say find the medium that speaks best for you. I would say the one big thing I would say that is not self-promotional is only use books containing real LSAT questions. Don't use LSAT for Dummies. Don't use Barron's. Use resources that are tried and true, are well reviewed, and use real LSAT questions licensed from the Law School Admission Council. Fake LSAT questions often contain typos and mistakes and are not realistic, and so they would actually discourage you and waste your time. And the last thing you need when you're studying for an exam as taxing as the LSAT is problems that are flawed themselves. So don't resort to those. Personally, I have a wide variety of resources, both in book and video form. I have on my website, the LSAT blog, I have a variety of books, including guides, cheat sheets, checklists, explanations, and I'm linking those for you here. I also have, of course, the full video courses for every section. So I'd encourage you to peruse those as well. I also have, of course, the LSAT Unplugged podcast, the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. And so you may learn best in one medium versus another, but I'd encourage you, of course, to examine the wide variety of options out there and find what speaks best to you. I don't have a particular recommendation outside, of course, of my own materials. But also, I would say if you want to get a tutor or take a class, make sure that you can actually interact with that instructor first in some way, like using a free sample of some kind. And so, of course, I've got a ton on YouTube if you want to see what my coaching style is like before choosing to work with me, for example. But if you're looking for, let's say, an in-person class, actually sit in on a class taught by that specific instructor. Don't just go with the company that's offering it, because, of course, instructor quality can vary widely. And some companies don't even require the instructor to have taken a real official LSAT. And some companies like Kaplan, for example, don't require them to have taken a real LSAT, or don't even require them to have scored above 170. And personally, I think that scoring above 170 should be an absolute requirement for anyone teaching the LSAT, because that's what demonstrates true proficiency. Scoring a 160 or 165 is certainly good, but I don't know if it's good enough to help someone else achieve a score in the 170s. And personally, if you're curious about my credentials, I went personally from a 152 to a 175 on an official LSAT. And it took me an entire grueling year to get there, where I did every exam ever released, every book I could find. And I really suffered along the way. I really challenged my sense of self-worth and intellect, but I made it there in the end. And I became so obsessed with this exam that I chose to teach it as my profession. And I actually never went to law school. I got so focused on this that I never went. And I don't actually plan to go, because I love what I'm doing now and I wouldn't want to give it up. So anyway, I hope that addressed that question. We've got Ronald asking about reading comprehension resources. If I have any links. Yes, I have a variety of links. I'm linking you to my YouTube playlist focused on reading comprehension, as well as a list of articles focused on reading comprehension prep specifically, where I can go into more depth on any topic you like about reading comp. And if there's a question I haven't covered in those resources, just let me know and I will create something specifically for you around that, because that's what I like to do. I like to actually custom create videos and articles in response to student requests. And so that's part of what I do for my students. And so I'm happy to extend that to you as well, of course, Ronald. So feel free to look at those and then get back to me if I'm missing anything. I thought I might talk a little bit about study plans, because someone was asking about digital LSAT prep study plans specifically. And so I'll first talk about studying in general, and then I'll talk a bit about digital LSAT prep specifically. And so one of the first resources I created when I started the LSAT blog was study schedules, specifically week by week ones, but students wanted more depth. So I actually then created day by day study plans, showing you exactly what to be doing every single day over the course of your prep. Basically, which of my resources to use, whether articles or videos, before doing relevant practice problems of that type. And so I've laid out those study plans for you. If you need one, let me know. I'll send them to you. But they're based around a certain framework, which I call the LASER approach to LSAT studying. LASER is an acronym standing for learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. Learning is theory, basically reading textbook chapters, reading articles, watching my videos to learn the basics underlying each section and each question type. Then A is for accuracy, doing individual questions by type, drilling them to learn the basics of that type in practice. S is for sections, doing timed 35-minute sections to work on your pacing. E is for exams and endurance, doing full-length 5-section exams. And then R is for review, which I've talked a little bit about, but I'll go into more depth on. Basically, as part of your review process, which is often too overlooked, you want to look at where specifically did your misunderstanding stem from? Was it in the stimulus? Was it in the question stem? Was it in the choices? If it was in the choices, you want to look at what was tempting about the wrong answer that made you pick it, and what ultimately makes it wrong. And what was discouraging about the right answer that pushed you away from it, and what ultimately makes it correct. You want to do that again and again and again so you can spot the traps of encouragement towards wrong answers and the traps of discouragement away from right answers. And you're not falling for every single trap, or else you'd be getting everything wrong. But for every single question that you have difficulty with or get wrong, including those where you are down to 2 and you guess and got lucky, but it could have just as easily gone the other way the next time around, you want to review those as well. This takes time. That's why I say typically you don't want to do more than 2 timed exams per week, because you also need to allow time for detailed review of those exams. And properly reviewing a single exam could take 3 to 5 hours or more, because if you are reviewing everything you got wrong and everything you had difficulty with, that will typically be at least 20 to 30 questions. So spending even 5 minutes a question would take close to 3 hours. And spending 10 minutes per question would take, of course, double that. And so it takes a lot of time, but it's worth it. Like I said, you want to do fewer exams and review them in more depth than do more exams, but only do a surface level review. Now, as for study plans, I saw Veronica asking, do I have one for a year? I don't have one for an entire year yet, although I'm sure I will create one at some point. Right now, the longest one I have is for a 7-month timeline. But for now, what I would suggest is you basically take my longer plan and spread it out, meaning you do less work per day or less work per week. And you also, of course, budget in time for holidays, time for being sick, time for family obligations. The 7-month plan assumes that you're actually studying every single week and every single day almost for that 7-month period, which obviously is not totally realistic. It's just a framework. And so I would say either do more problems of each type or overall, or do less work each day, because the schedule is more important for the level of specificity it contains about what to do than the particular day-by-day breakdown. So I hope that addresses that, but of course, feel free to ask follow-ups now or later. We had Annika asking about reading non-LSAT books on speed reading and dealing with time pressure in general. So speed reading is something that I can certainly recommend. There actually is a website I can show you that helps with this, and I will pull it up for you here. Let's see, basically, it's called phrasereader.com. And what it does is it allows you to input certain text into a field and then display it for yourself at different speeds. So let's say that we were going to take this text, for example, from LSAC's site, we put it in, we parse, and we say we want to display to ourselves at 300 words per minute. Hit play, it starts displaying it at that certain speed. And so you can train yourself to read at faster and faster speeds. Because let's say we want to display it now at 600 words per minute, which is really, really fast. It would go like this. So you're basically putting yourself on this kind of reading comprehension treadmill to display text for yourself at faster and faster speeds. Maybe you start with 300 words per minute, but you slowly increase it to 325, 350, 375, 400, and so on. By doing that, you get more comfortable at reading text on screen and reading at increasingly faster speeds. And that's important because LSAT text is dense, but now with the digital LSAT, you actually are reading it on a screen. And so I could talk a little bit about digital LSAT prep specifically now, and then I'll circle back to time pressure. So digital LSAT prep, of course, the digital LSAT is full on in North America now. Everyone in North America is taking it on tablet, specifically a Microsoft Surface Go tablet that's 10 inches. And so I would recommend practicing or studying at least a little bit on a tablet. You can use a Samsung, you can use an iPad, you can use an Amazon Fire tablet for $150 and then return it later if you decide that it's not for you. Any of those is perfectly fine, but I would recommend studying with one at least to some extent, because that way you'll be more comfortable with it when you're doing it on test day. I wouldn't want you to walk in on test day having never done any practice problems on a tablet with the digital LSAT interface. And so I would recommend getting a tablet or borrowing one and then going on LSAC's site at familiar.lsac.org and playing around with the digital LSAT functionalities, like the highlighting, the underlining, the increasing and decreasing the text size, the flagging, the eliminating choices. I've shared the link with you there if you want to look at it on your own later. But basically, LSAC has released 3 exams in the digital format, exams 71, 73, and 74, and they will presumably release more at some future date. But for now, that's what we have. And so I'd say go on LSAC's site and play around with it and try out doing problems in the digital LSAT interface, because it is different, of course. I think for most students who are on the younger side, anyone under the age of 40 is probably going to be relatively comfortable with digital interface and technology and such. And those over 40 might also, because, let's say we're all using smartphones these days anyway, right? So how different is it really? I think that Might seem a little bit scary at first, but more and more the students I'm speaking with about this, they actually prefer it in a way. They think they like being able to eliminate things, and they think it somewhat flows more smoothly. And so I would encourage you to try it out and not be intimidated by it. Because of course the exam content has not changed at all. Only the interface in which it's being delivered is what's changed. Now, back to the question of time pressure on the LSAT. And so time pressure, of course, time pressure is real. Aside from the content of the exam, the timing adds another level or layer of difficulty. And so that's why in that study plan framework I laid out, learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review, phase 3, which is sections, that is where we introduce the timing, where we're giving you timed 35-minute sections to work on your pacing. And I want you to introduce that relatively early in your prep once you've built a strong foundation in that section, because it's really important. The exam is so unreasonably timed that most people are doomed to run out of time before reaching the end. And so you've got to get used to basically speeding up, not getting bogged down, blasting through the easier questions so you've built up a time bank to do the tougher questions later in the section. And personally, I might even flag 3 to 4 questions in a single logical reasoning question to skip, come back to at the end, so I can knock out anything else that might be slightly easier. So for example, personally, I might flag parallel reasoning questions or flag principal application questions or anything tough on science or philosophy or aestheticism, things that I just don't like. And I'll say, I don't want to deal with this right now. I'm going to come back to it at the end after I've knocked out everything else, because everything's worth the same. Why get stuck on one hard question when there might be easier ones later that I could knock out and then come back to, the harder ones? So that's one way I deal with time pressure, is I just skip stuff. That's for logical reasoning. Then for games, I maximize use of previous work, previous drawn diagrams. And so every valid hypothetical scenario I draw for a game, I save it so I can come back to it later when I'm solving more global general questions. And so I might do the orientation question first, then the local if questions that require drawing new diagrams, then the global general, like must be true or cannot be true or could be true questions, where I can use those previous diagrams to potentially eliminate some choices or maybe even get the correct answer right off the bat. Then for reading comp, like I said, I'll do the global main idea questions first, then the local questions, then the general inferential questions that require more reading between the lines. So I do things in an order that works for me. So I'm doing the toughest stuff last, and I'm building my understanding of the passage or the game as I go. And then, yeah, just doing lots of time sections, lots of timed exams, just practice. Practice helps you improve your pacing and improve your endurance at the same time. And ideally, I'd want you to do at least 10 full-length timed exams prior to test day. So you've really got a lot under your belt, so that when you're walking in on test day, that new exam you're taking that actually counts is just another one in a long string of full-length timed exams up to that point. So you're really just going through the motions yet again, but it's nothing totally new for you. Okay, the writing sample. So the writing sample has also gone digital, and it may actually carry slightly more weight than it previously did because now it's typed. And it's funny, I was talking with an admission officer earlier this week who was saying that maybe they previously could have only been able to actually read 1 in 10 handwritten writing samples because everyone's handwriting is so bad. So they weren't going to bother sifting through them. It just wasn't worth it for them in a lot of cases. But now that it's typed and it's easier to read, they may actually be slightly more likely to look at it. When do they look at it though? Primarily in cases where they have concerns over someone's writing ability. If their English grades weren't good in college, or if they are a non-native English speaker, they want to really confirm that this person is proficient in English. And so the writing sample is a way for them to get an unfiltered sample of what your writing is actually like. You're doing the writing sample on your own time after the exam date, not at the test center itself. It used to be you do 5 sections of the exam that were LSAT content, 5 including the experimental section. Then you do the writing sample, but your brain, of course, is fried by that point, and so you're not going to do a great job on it, most likely. And maybe that's why the handwriting was bad also, because people were just too tired to even try. But now that it's typed and you're doing it later, you have the chance to do it when you're fresh and do the best job possible. There is a spell check function, and it's still 35 minutes timed strictly. you're actually doing it on LSAC's site from your own device, but they're monitoring you with a webcam and a microphone to make sure it's really you and that no one is helping you do it. And so you have up to 1 year to complete it after your scheduled LSAT test date, but they will not release your LSAT score to law schools until you have fully submitted your writing sample. And so don't forget about it because you wouldn't want it to delay your application. But yeah, still try on it, give it your best effort, and do it when you're fresh. But I wouldn't worry too much about it because, of course, it still is not scored. I wouldn't focus on it to the exclusion of actual LSAT studying. I would do it only after you have completed the LSAT and you're done with it. But yeah, just pick a day when you're pretty free and you're fresh and give it your best shot. Happy to answer follow-ups on it, but I don't think there's much more to say on it right now anyway. As for taking the GRE versus the LSAT, this is a hot topic. So more and more schools are taking the GRE after Harvard took it, then other schools started following suit more, but I wouldn't recommend it because it doesn't have the same demonstrated correlation with first-year law school grades. And for most applicants, the LSAT is really a better way to go. In fact, of course, it shows that you're serious about law school and it shows that you have what it takes and that law school is not simply an afterthought for you where you're doing it simply because, well, you already have the GRE score and you're already applying to a master's program anyway or business program anyway, so why not throw it in a law school application as well just to see what happens. The LSAT, because it's exclusively for law school, it shows that you're serious about pursuing law school specifically, and it also proves that you have the ability to do well in it because it's strongly correlated with first-year law school grades, and the GRE has not been shown to the same extent. Also, fewer than 5% of applicants are accepted with GRE scores relative to LSAT scores. And so it's a small, very small minority of students that are actually getting in with GRE specifically, and it's mainly reserved for special cases where someone has a really strong work background, or let's say they're experienced in the hard sciences, and so that's why they've taken the GRE. Maybe they've done a master's in something science or math related. But I think for the average pre-law major or poli-sci major, it's going to be taken that you weren't taking it that seriously, or maybe you were afraid you wouldn't do well in the LSAT. Also, if you've already taken the LSAT and that score is on record, that score will be considered for U.S. News Rankings and American Bar Association. And so you can't take the LSAT, do terribly on it, then take the GRE instead, because the LSAT score will still count against you unless you can get a higher one. And so I wouldn't take it as an alternative. I would focus on the LSAT specifically. Let's see, other questions. Logic, let's see, I'm not sure I fill in. Is this logic game? Alex is asking about diagramming every answer. Are you referring to logic games or logical reasoning? Okay, for logic games. As for how to diagram tougher games, I have plenty of video explanations for the vast majority of logic games ever released, actually. And they are on my YouTube channel. I'm linking you here if you want to check them out. And you can just basically see my walkthroughs of most logic games ever released. So they're basically tutorials walking through all of these games, the full setup, as well as all the questions. And as for diagramming every answer, if you're diagramming every single answer choice, that means that you're doing what's called brute forcing. And there's usually a more efficient approach that you can take. So I would suggest that you consider maybe making more inferences up front if possible, or watch my videos to see how to make more inferences up front so that you can do less work over the course of the game. Obviously, you can't do that for every single logic game, but for a lot of them, you can. And when you can do more work up front and less work over the course of the game and do things more efficiently, you'll save some time. I don't think that you should have to diagram every single choice. If you do, you're probably just doing more work than is necessary, but there's some faster way. Like I said previously, also making use of previous work can help you save time as well and maybe allow you to avoid making quite so many diagrams going forward. Follow-up question about retaking. If you're pretty happy with your LSAT score already, should you retake again just to improve a few points more? Is it worth the risk of maybe going down a few points? So this comes back to what I was saying earlier, where I would in fact encourage you to retake if you think you could do better. Because if you go down, there's not a real downside because law schools don't average scores. They only take the highest score. So if you go down, you still have your previous score that you can rest upon. And if you go up, that's even better. You can apply with a higher score. So to me, if you are willing to delay your application a little bit by a month or two, and you think you could potentially do better, then I would say, yeah, go for it. Let's say if let's say if your prep test score average was a 170, but then you got a 167 on test day, maybe it's worth retaking and seeing if you can break 170. If you can, fantastic. If not, no big deal. You still have your 167. And so I really don't see much of a downside other than delaying your application slightly. But if you're considering November or January, that's still squarely and solidly within this cycle. No real downside that I can see. So yeah, I would say go for it. The retake limits. Yeah. So the LSAC, they have instituted new retake limits this year. It used to be that you could only take the LSAT 3 times in a 2-year period. Then they removed that limit and said you can take it an unlimited number of times. But they ran into an issue because, like I said earlier, going from administering the LSAT 4 times a year to 9 or 10 times a year, they now have to reuse all these old undisclosed test forms. And so they don't want people to take the same test form multiple times. Like, let's say you took the LSAT outside the US 1 year, and the following year you're back in the US. They don't want you seeing those exact same exams again. They want to minimize the number of times somebody could potentially see the same questions. And of course, that would unfairly inflate their scores. What they've done now is they've instituted new limits where you can only take the LSAT 3 times in one testing cycle, a testing cycle running from June to May, 5 times in a 5-year period, 7 times for life. And if you get a 180, you can't take it again. So those are the new limits. They said that those limits will affect less than 1% of test takers. So it's not really a big deal. I don't love it, of course, because I think that the more retakes you can have, the higher your score can go because of that margin of error, like I said, and because schools don't average scores. So there's no downside to retaking. But the limits are the limits. Just be aware of them. You could take the LSAT, let's say, November, January, and March, then take it again in June because it's a new admissions cycle, and that 3 times in one cycle resets in June. So just be aware of that, but it's not a huge deal for most people, I think. Got a question about question stems. What are question stems and what are their categories? So a question stem is that short phrase appearing after a stimulus in logical reasoning, for example. So you have the paragraph, which is the argument or the stimulus. Then you have the short question stem saying something like, which one of the following is required by the argument? Which would be like, which one of the following assumptions is required by the argument, or which one of the following must be true on the basis of the argument above? So that is called a question stem, and they're most often referred to, let's say, in logical reasoning, where you have around 15 different question stem types, like strengthen, weaken, must be true, conclusion, flaw, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, evaluate the argument, parallel reasoning, and so on. And these are worth studying because a weaken question is asking for something quite different from a flaw question. A necessary assumption is asking for something very different from a sufficient assumption question. And so it's worth becoming proficient in knowing exactly what these different question stem types are asking for so that you can evaluate the argument from the proper perspective. And so one of the earlier phases in my LSAT study schedules is learning the basics, L in laser, learning accuracy sessions, exams, and review. L is for learning the theory, which is the basics of what are the different question types on the LSAT. What is an ordering game? What is a grouping game? What is a strengthening question? What is a weakening question? What is a main idea question in reading comp versus what is a detail-oriented question in reading comp? So they're asking for different things, and part of being good at the LSAT is knowing what they're asking you to do. Because a lot of times they will give you the right answer to the wrong question as a trap. Like for necessary assumption question, they will throw in there a sufficient assumption as a tempting wrong answer because they're very sneaky people, and they will trip up a lot of students by doing so. So it's your job to stay laser focused on the task at hand so that you can better evaluate the argument properly. And so in my study plans, I lay out a process for you to go about this systematically so that you're always learning the basics of a given question type before doing several problems of that type. And so I actually have a page on my website where I list for you several really hundreds of logical reasoning questions organized by type, specifically by question stem type, so that you can do a bunch of flaw questions in a row and become proficient in solving what flaw questions are asking you to do. So I've laid that out there. It's also linked within my study plans. So I'll say basically, read this article on this question type, then watch my video on that same type, then do a couple dozen problems of that type out of the actual official LSAT prep tests. And by doing so, you drill and deepen your understanding of what that question type is asking you to do, so that when you see it in the broad mix of a logical reasoning section where they're throwing at you a variety of types, one after the other, like dodgeball, you can handle each one because you've become so deeply proficient in what it is that they're asking you to do. And so here's a link to those weekly study schedules as well, if you're looking for a general sense of what my frameworks are like under this laser approach to LSAT studying. So I know I've handled a lot of questions for you here today, and I appreciate your joining me on a Friday afternoon. I'm happy to answer any other follow-ups that you may have. Please keep in touch and let me know if you need anything at all as you move forward. As you know, I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best, everyone, and take care. Have a great weekend. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.